What's the last thing you'd eat if you knew you were going to die tomorrow? It's a haunting question, and for death row inmates, it's one they actually have to answer. From full feasts to single snacks, these final meals offer a strange, personal glimpse into the minds of some of the world's most notorious criminals just hours before their execution. Let's take a look at what they chose and what it might say about them. Victor Feguer. Victor Feguer's name might not echo through the halls of true crime history like some of the other criminals, but his final act before death left a forever imprint. At just 28 years old, Feguer was sentenced to die by hanging in Iowa for kidnapping and murder, becoming the last federal inmate executed in the United States before the death penalty came to a halt in the wake of Furman versus Georgia. The media barely blinked at his execution, and for years his story gathered dust, until nearly 4 decades later when the execution of Timothy McVeigh pulled Feguer's name back into the spotlight. But what truly makes Victor unforgettable is his hauntingly symbolic last meal, a single olive with the pit still inside. And that was all he had as his final meal. Timothy McVeigh didn't just kill people left and right. He had a thing for explosives. After turning the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building into a grave for 168 people, including 19 children. The 1995 Oklahoma City bombing wasn't just a crime. For the families of the victims, it was an act of domestic terrorism that changed the American psyche forever. McVeigh never showed remorse, and when his day of reckoning came in 2001, his final request reflected his cold, calculated demeanor. No grand feast, just 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. In that moment, McVeigh didn't soften, didn't reveal a hint of humanity, just a quiet final indulgence from someone who had long since chosen destruction over peace. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy wore 2 masks. One was painted with bright colors and a clown's smile, the other soaked in horror and blood. Before the truth of his crimes came to light, Gacy was a local businessman managing KFC franchises and performing at parties in full clown attire. But beneath the face paint was a serial killer who tortured and murdered at least 33 boys and young men, burying many of them under his own home in suburban Illinois. When he finally faced death by lethal injection at age 52, his final meal felt as disturbing as his dual life. He ordered 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe KFC, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. It wasn't just a last meal, it was a return to the facade he had once used to mask his monstrosity. Even in his last moments, Gacy served up a disturbing reminder of how ordinary evil can pretend to be. Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector's final days on death row were filled with controversy, not just for the crime he committed, but for the condition he was in when the state chose to end his life. In 1981, after killing a man in a restaurant and agreeing to surrender, Rector pulled a cruel twist. He shot the police officer who came to negotiate his surrender in the back, then turned the gun on himself in a botched suicide attempt. He survived, but the bullet to his brain left him with severe mental impairments. His injury was so profound that many argued he no longer understood his fate. Despite this, Arkansas pressed forward. In a moment that still rattles anyone who hears it, Rector requested steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie for his last meal, but didn't touch the pie. When a guard asked, he simply said, "I'm saving it for later." Those 5 words, spoken by a man deemed too mentally compromised to grasp his own execution, became a haunting symbol of the debate over capital punishment. And as political leaders like Bill Clinton made high-profile choices around his case, Rector's story transformed from a criminal sentence to a national conversation about justice, mercy, and mental health. Stephen Wayne Anderson. Stephen Wayne Anderson lived a life of violence long before his name made headlines. A contract killer, and a confessed murderer of at least 8 people, including a fellow inmate. Anderson was the very picture of cold-blooded brutality. He escaped prison, committed burglaries, and showed no hesitation in turning deadly at any moment. But when the state of California finally brought him to the execution chamber at San Quentin in 2002, what he asked for in his final moments caught many off guard. His last meal wasn't grand, but it was oddly detailed. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, a pint of cottage cheese, a hominy and corn mixture, peach pie, chocolate chip ice cream, and radishes. Somehow, that simple, even childlike assortment of comfort foods stood in jarring contrast to the life he'd lived, a life that left victims across the country. For a man who'd caused so much pain, those last bites seemed more like a return to something innocent, long lost, rather than a fitting end for a killer who had once called murder a job. Angel Nieves Diaz. Angel Nieves Diaz was a man who refused to play along, even at the end. Convicted for the murder of a Florida strip club manager, Diaz was already serving time for a different murder in Puerto Rico when he escaped prison and made his way to the mainland. Despite the charges, Diaz maintained his innocence until the moment he was strapped to the gurney. And when it came time for his last meal, he made a decision that spoke volumes. He declined it. The prison served him the standard meal anyway, and he refused that too. In the end, Diaz went to his death on an empty stomach, with no final meals and no final words. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie Lee Gardner's final moments were as dramatic as the life that led him there. Sentenced to death for fatally shooting a lawyer during a courthouse escape attempt, Gardner's long and violent history painted the portrait of a man molded by chaos and confinement. From the robbery that left one man dead to the courtroom ambush that cost another his life, Gardner's crimes prompted sweeping changes in courthouse security across Utah. For nearly 25 years, he waded through the court system, while his attorneys painted a picture of a tormented childhood and a man shaped by neglect and incarceration. But what made Gardner's case truly infamous wasn't just his crimes, it was his execution. In 2010, he chose the firing squad, a method long abandoned by most states. As the world watched, Gardner sat down to steak, lobster tail, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream, savoring every bite while watching the full Lord of the Rings trilogy. Alan Lee Tiny Davis. Alan Lee Tiny Davis may have had a deceptively soft nickname, but the crimes he committed were among the most savage and stomach-turning in Florida's history. In 1982, he broke into the home of a pregnant woman, Nancy Weiler, and unleashed unimaginable violence, beating her with a .375 Magnum until she was barely recognizable, and shooting her 2 young daughters, one of whom he later bludgeoned to death as she tried to flee. Davis was already on parole at the time for armed robbery, and later admitted he had intended to and kill the eldest daughter before murdering the rest of the family. When Florida brought him to the electric chair in 1999, his execution was supposed to be a final reckoning, but instead it sparked national outrage. Witnesses described a horrifying scene. Davis bleeding from the nose, his body still moving after the switch was pulled, raising disturbing questions about the use of Old Sparky. Yet, before all that, Davis indulged in a gluttonous last meal: lobster tail, shrimp, fried clams, fried potatoes, garlic bread, and a towering 32-ounce A&W root beer. That overindulgence, paired with the grim spectacle of his death, made his case one of the most controversial in the history of capital punishment. Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis was a Southern woman whose soft-spoken demeanor masked a deadly scheme rooted in greed. In 2002, she orchestrated the murders of her husband and stepson, all for a $250,000 life insurance policy. It was a cold and calculated plan. Lewis seduced two younger men into carrying out the killings, and then waited with chilling patience for the money to roll in. But justice caught up with her, and after her conviction, Lewis became the only woman on death row in Virginia, and the first to be executed in the state in nearly a century. Her case drew fierce debate over her mental capacity, her role in the plot, and whether her gender was influencing public sentiment. Yet in the hours before her execution, Teresa made no pleas for mercy. Instead, she asked for a final meal that sounded like a scene from a Sunday family dinner: fried chicken, peas bathed in butter, apple pie, and a can of Dr. Pepper. That simple, almost nostalgic meal stood in eerie contrast to the dark motives that landed her on death row. Her execution became a flashpoint in the debate over capital punishment and made her the last woman ever executed in Virginia's history. Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants living in the U.S. They were also anarchists, which means they didn't believe in government control. In 1920, there was a robbery at a shoe company in Massachusetts, and during the heist, a guard and a paymaster were shot and killed. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and charged with the murders. The trial didn't last very long. After just a few hours of discussion, the jury found them guilty. Many people believed the verdict was unfair and influenced by prejudice. You see, back then, there was a lot of hate against immigrants, Italians, and anarchists. Some even said Sacco and Vanzetti were judged more for who they were than what they actually did. In 1927, after 7 long years, both men were executed in the electric chair. Sacco was 36 and Vanzetti was 39. For their final meal, they asked for something simple: soup, tea, meat, and toast. Years later, the governor of Massachusetts admitted that their trial hadn't been fair. Since then, people have continued to talk about their case, wondering if they were truly guilty or just victims of a biased system. Ronnie Threadgill. Ronnie Threadgill was sentenced to death for shooting and killing a teenager during a carjacking outside a nightclub. This happened 12 years before his execution. At the age of 40, he was put to death by lethal injection in Texas. Just hours before, the U.S. Supreme Court turned down his final appeal. Ronnie had requested a full meal for his last supper: baked chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, vegetables, sweet peas, bread, tea, water, and punch. But in 2011, Texas ended the tradition of giving inmates their requested last meals. So in the end, he ate the same food as everyone else in his prison unit. David Wayne Stoker. David Stoker was found guilty of killing a 50-year-old Baptist minister named David Manrique in what police said was a convenience store robbery in Hale Center, Texas. Stoker was offered 2 chances to plead guilty and avoid the death penalty, but he refused. He insisted he was innocent until the very end. His trial was dramatic, with talk of death threats, another murder accusation, and testimony from a man known as Dr. Death. The jury made its decision after just 7 hours, and 3 days later, Stoker was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was part of a tough crowd. His group of friends included people involved in drugs and weapons. One of them, Carrie Todd, even turned in the murder weapon to the authorities and testified against Stoker. Todd was also an informant for the FBI. Stoker's car was searched weeks after the murder, and the police said they found bullets that matched the gun used. But here's the twist. Stoker didn't even own that car at the time of the murder. His sister said he only bought it later and claimed he first received the gun a month after the crime, just to fix a broken trigger. The investigation was sloppy. The police chief threw away a piece of paper with a bloody fingerprint. Shell casings at the scene were tampered with. Even the handling of bullets during the investigation didn't add up. Officers kept changing their stories. The trial drew a lot of attention, and security had to be increased after Stoker got a death threat in court. A man whose brother had been killed even claimed that Stoker was the murderer. Before he was executed, David Wayne Stoker asked for 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, and ice cream as his final meal. Thomas Barefoot. Thomas Barefoot was convicted of killing a police officer in Texas. After the trial, the same jury had to decide if he should get the death penalty. According to Texas law, they had to consider if Barefoot would be dangerous in the future. To support their case, the prosecution brought in 2 psychiatrists. Interestingly, neither of them had ever spoken to Barefoot or examined him. Still, they confidently said he was a dangerous sociopath and would likely commit more violent crimes. One even said Barefoot scored above 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 for sociopathic traits. Despite concerns from experts about how unreliable this kind of psychiatric prediction can be, the jury gave him the death penalty. For his last meal, Thomas Barefoot made a detailed request. He asked for chef soup with crackers, chili with beans, steamed rice, seasoned pinto beans, corn O'Brien, and a salad. Johnny Frank Garrett. Johnny Frank Garrett was just 17 years old when he was accused of a brutal crime in 1981. The case was chilling. A 76-year-old Catholic nun, Sister Tadea Benz, was S.A.'d and murdered in a convent in Amarillo, Texas, right across the street from Garrett's home. He was arrested 9 days later and charged with the crime. Despite being a teenager, he was considered legally an adult under Texas law and was sentenced to death. Johnny always maintained his innocence, and many believed there were serious issues with the evidence and trial. His case became widely known, especially after his execution in 1992. For his last meal, Johnny Garrett asked for a simple but sweet comfort food, a bowl of chocolate and strawberry ice cream. Gerald Lee Mitchell. In Houston, Gerald Mitchell met 2 young men, Charles Marino and Kenneth Fleming, in a park. He offered to sell them marijuana, but things quickly turned dark. Mitchell pulled out a sawed-off shotgun, forced them to drive to an empty house, robbed them, and then shot them both. Charles Marino died, but Kenneth Fleming survived with a hip injury. An eyewitness saw Mitchell leaving the scene, and when police caught him driving Marino's car, he confessed, saying, "I shot the 2 white boys." He later claimed it was an accident. Shockingly, the same day, Mitchell also killed another man, Hector Mangia, during a robbery over a necklace. He was only 17 at the time of the murders. For his last meal, Mitchell made a simple and unique request, a bag of assorted Jolly Ranchers candies. Robert Anthony Madden. Robert Madden was convicted for the brutal murder of 2 people, Herbert Megison and his son Gary. Their bodies were found in a creek days after their deaths. Herbert had been shot with a .22 pistol, and Gary had been shot, had his throat slashed, and had knife wounds on his hands and arms. Madden was caught after trying to use Herbert's credit card. He also tried to sell the weapons used in the murder, including a blood-stained knife and 2 guns. When it came time for his execution, Madden made a compassionate request. He asked that his final meal be given to a homeless person. Unfortunately, that request was denied. James Beathard. James Beathard was executed for his role in a horrific 1984 triple murder in a small East Texas town. Gene Hathorne Sr., his wife Linda, and their 14-year-old son Marcus were shot dead in their mobile home while watching TV. Though there was no physical evidence tying Beathard to the scene, no fingerprints, no blood, no footprints, he eventually told police he had gone with Gene Hathorne Jr., the victim's son, thinking they were doing a drug deal. Beathard said when Hathorne Jr. started shooting his own family, he panicked and ran into the woods. Even so, Beathard was sentenced to death. For his last meal, he chose a Southern-style comfort feast: fried catfish, fried chicken, French fries, onion rings, green salad, fresh carrots, and a Coke. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos had one of the most chilling stories in the world of true crime. She was a woman who worked as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, and between 1989 and 1990, she killed 7 of her male clients. Aileen claimed that each of these men either raped her or tried to, and that she only shot them in self-defense. The courts didn't buy it. She was sentenced to death for 6 of those murders and ended up spending more than a decade on death row. On October 9, 2002, Aileen was executed by lethal injection. And when it came to her final meal, she didn't ask for anything fancy or over the top. All she wanted was a simple cup of black coffee, as if it was any other morning. Karla Faye Tucker. Karla Faye Tucker's case was one that got a lot of people talking. Back in 1983, during a burglary in Texas, she used a pickaxe to brutally murder 2 people. She was only in her early 20s. While she was in prison, Karla claimed she had completely changed. She became a born-again Christian and talked openly about her faith. Over the years, more and more people believed she had truly turned her life around. In fact, people from around the world, including some political leaders, asked for her life to be spared. But the state of Texas didn't budge. On February 3, 1998, Karla was executed by lethal injection. She had spent 14 years on death row. Her last meal? Surprisingly simple. She asked for a garden salad with ranch dressing, a banana, and a peach. And then there's Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Between the 1970s and early 80s, Bundy murdered at least 30 young women, possibly more. He escaped from jail twice, acted as his own lawyer, and became a twisted media sensation. When he was finally scheduled to die in 1989, Bundy was given the chance to choose his last meal, but he refused to make a request. So the prison gave him the standard last meal: steak, medium rare, over-easy eggs, hash browns, toast with butter and jam, milk, coffee, juice, and a bowl of jelly. And yet, he didn't eat a single bite. Now back to the question of what happened in 2011 that made Texas say, no more special meals. Well, that was because of Lawrence Russell Brewer, a white supremacist who was executed for a brutal hate crime. He ordered 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, a bowl of fried okra, a pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge. And then he refused to eat a single bite. That act sparked outrage, and Texas lawmakers quickly shut down the tradition. But in the end, it's a strange and somber ritual that leaves us wondering, if your life came down to one final meal, what would you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.